All right. So this week we are talking about the relationship between physical activity, fitness, and all-cause mortality. So first, quick refresher. What is the difference between physical activity and fitness? I'm hoping a couple of you respond to this on perusal just to sort of get the conversation going and start your brain thinking about, okay, wait, what are these topics that we're going to be examining this week? The next thing is what is all-cause mortality? And we're going to go into that in the next couple of slides, but basically it's you died from anything. It doesn't matter what the thing is that killed you. We're just interested in death, period. Okay, maybe my slides are moving, maybe they're not. There we go. Okay, so quick review of what we talked about last week. So we covered domains of physical activity, right? We had the occupational, domestic, transportation, and leisure domains. You should be able to identify what an example of each of those might be. We talked about changes in the research paradigm, so moving more really from that sports science focused, like sort of individual athlete focus, to focusing on like the health of the general population as well as individuals in a clinical sense, and then sort of shifting into that more ecological paradigm where we're really considering sort of built environment, sense of community, right? Access to green spaces, right? Safety, lighting. We talked about all of those things. And then the majority of our time we spent focused on physical activity measurement. So here we were looking at different methods, right? So you should be familiar with what self-report is. You should be familiar with a variety of different devices. So heart rate monitors, pedometers, accelerometers, and sort of some of the benefits and limitations of those different measurements, direct observation, calorimetry included. You should also be able to consider whether or not and define whether or not a measure is valid or reliable and discuss at least its feasibility in terms of use for a specific study design. We did talk about device-specific differences, mostly really at the very end there, talking about sort of combining data from different accelerometers and how to combine that data and also the problem with sometimes combining that data. All right, so jumping into this week, we want to be able to describe how physical activity, fitness, and mortality are related. We want to interpret different exposure measurements of physical activity. So looking at Met hours per week, kcals per week, minutes per day, minutes per week of activity. We also want to interpret common effect sizes in the context of PA and mortality. So now we're looking at sort of the outcome measurements, right? So the relative risk and the hazard ratios. And then lastly, just recognizing how fitness and changes in fitness contribute to morbidity and mortality. Okay. All right. So really quick overview, sort of like a big picture zoom out to start today, looking at morbidity, mortality, and the economy. So first we have looking at life expectancy by sex and at the age of 65 from birth. And this is 2022-2023 data from the CDC, at least from the CDC's website. Right, we noticed that one, if we compare 2022 to 2023, we have increases in life expectancy. Now, they're not huge, right? But we do see increases there for males and females and for individuals older than the age of 65. Okay. So generally, though, when we compare the United States life expectancy, so this was 2017 data at 78.6, right? And if we go back to this data, right, it was 78.6. Now it's 78.4, right? So it's actually gone down since 2017 a little bit, but stayed pretty similar. When we compare that to other countries' averages, other high-income country averages, the average is about 82.3%. So we're sort of lagging behind. And indeed, when we look at it from this perspective, it looks even worse because this is now not just what's the difference in life expectancy, but how is that difference related to the amount that the US spends on healthcare, right? So not only are we living less time, but actually we're spending more. So, why is that? So one, why might we be dying earlier on average? Lots of potential reasons. There are more injuries and violence in the US. So more deaths from firearms, more deaths from drug overdoses, more deaths from motor vehicle accidents as well, right? And that makes sense. We talked about how many people are driving cars here as opposed to driving cars elsewhere. We also don't have strict gun laws, right, like other places do. So we would expect that increase in death as a result of those laws. We have higher maternal and infant death rates in this country compared to these other countries. So that's one of the sources. Then there's other like behavioral and social risk factors. So of course we can look at things like high levels of sedentary behavior, poor diet, stress, limited social safety nets. However, when we compare that to other countries, we don't necessarily see as big of a difference. So I don't know that you can attribute it to that. Um, so then why is healthcare so expensive in the US? One, I think that's important to point out is that the US does a lot of health related research that benefits a lot of countries and a lot of people's health across the world. So one, our investment in research may be part of that. Additionally, I think the administrative complexity of delivering a healthcare system like the US is, right? We have a multi-payer system and we're dealing with insurance, which has its own issues, but one of the potential costs associated with that is just that you have this huge overhead of administrative costs. Like, how do I actually manage as a physician billing different insurance companies? And then how does the insurance company handle tons of different providers who are all providing different services, sending them requests for funds, right? So it's a complex system. That doesn't make it bad, but it does typically make it pretty expensive. We also have a lot of specialty care in the US, so not maybe quite as much focus on primary care. Uh, so in any case, I wanted to provide a couple of reasons why we might see this, and then you can, do some research on your own. But I wanted to provide a little bit of context for that. So what then is killing us? So first, sorry, I should have spaced these out. But if we look on the left-hand side, that's 2022, 2023 data. And we have heart disease, cancer, unintentional injuries, stroke, chronic lower respiratory disease, Alzheimer's, diabetes, kidney disease, chronic liver disease, and COVID-19. So on that list, the only cause of death that is not a chronic disease is COVID-19. Okay. And you can also see that the death rate from COVID-19 dropped significantly from 2022 to 2023. Okay. So still one of the top 10 causes of death, right? But we saw that rate drop dramatically. Um, but what I did want to point out in sort of the larger context of things, so we do see death rates going down in most of these areas for the record, with the exception of cancer. But when we look at sort of human history, right? And this is not even close to human history, by the way, but more modern human history. So this is just a figure showing life expectancy from the 1500s to 2016, right? Life expectancy hovered around 30 years old for hundreds of years. And there's actually some interesting data that estimates life expectancy all the way back to like I think like 10,000 BC. And that's about where life expectancy has been hovering for thousands of years, right? About 30. Okay. It's only been since like in the 1850s, we saw some increase, especially with sanitation, right? And then further increase with, right, more sanitation, things like access to modern medicine, things like vaccines, right? But we see this massive, massive jump in life expectancy from about 1850 to the present day, right? So I think it's just worth noting sometimes we are talking about all of these diseases and we talk about this chronic disease epidemic, right? Which is true, right? That is what's killing people. It's across the globe. Okay. So this is data from the US, but it's happening across the globe. But one of the reasons why we see all this chronic disease is because infectious disease used to be killing people very early on in their lives. So we literally did not have time to develop these chronic diseases in the past, right? So sometimes people will say, well, we never used to see cancer rates, or cancer rates used to be a lot lower. Yeah, I mean, people used to die much, much earlier as well, though. So, um, it's helpful context to provide to that argument. So then how are different lifestyle factors contributing to these leading causes of death? And this is a really cool 2005 study. So it's showing uh, right, we have different lifestyle factors and how those lifestyle factors are contributing to deaths from specific diseases. So you can see that smoking accounts for a large portion of deaths due to its effect on cardiovascular disease. Huge amount on high blood pressure contributing to cardiovascular disease death. We've got obesity or high BMI right here. Again, cardiovascular disease, huge portion. Then if we look at some of the other diseases though, so smoking obviously contributing a lot to that cancer risk. We also have smoking contributing to respiratory diseases, so that chronic, right, we saw here, chronic lower respiratory diseases, case smoking is contributing to that significantly. Um, anyway, and you can run down this list and look at how different lifestyle factors are contributing to these diseases that are then ultimately killing us. Okay, so that's just a brief overview on, okay, where are we at in terms of life expectancy in general? And then we want to further look at, okay, now how do physical activity and physical fitness affect mortality? Okay, so that's what we're going to move into next. Now is a good time for a little break if you're going to take one. If we were doing this in class, we would be doing a Nearpod, but we're not. But I do think it's helpful to think about the statement, we were born to move, and whether you agree with that statement or disagree. So maybe you can drop a comment in the perusal about that. Excuse me. Okay. I'm hoping some of you dropped some comments. I'm not going to agree or disagree, but if you want a really, really fascinating conversation about this, talking to an evolutionary anthropologist about the physical activity and sedentary behavior habits of hunter-gatherer populations or subsistence farming populations. So interesting. Okay. And we're going to explore some epidemiology data to sort of consider this statement as well of whether or not we were born to move. So on the left, you have mortality data per 100,000 people. Okay. And we see that the rate of death is indeed higher in the Southwest or Southeast, sorry. We see that that also aligns pretty closely with the prevalence of meeting physical activity recommended guidelines. Again, not many people, so the lighter color representing that fewer people are meeting that guideline. Darker colors here darker colors indicating higher rates of mortality. Okay, so again, this is just looking at correlation and change over time. Okay, so not causal data, but certainly enough to think, okay, one, physical activity and fitness, in this case, just physical activity, are not evenly distributed geographically in the US. Okay, so that's something to consider here. But then also just that, yes, as in these areas where we see higher rates of mortality, we also see higher prevalence of not meeting physical activity guidelines. Okay, so in order to talk about physical activity, we really need to understand the FIT VP NTS sort of principle here. So you should know what it stands for. We have frequency, intensity, time, type, volume, progression. The T and the S are really just a suggestion that I've seen in a couple of papers that I like, but they talk about timing of nutrient intake and then sleep. Now, if you download the PowerPoint and look in the slide notes, I've got really clear definitions for each of these. So I'm going to run through them pretty quickly. But you should hopefully be familiar with some of these things. They're just dimensions of physical activity that you should be thinking about when reading studies. So frequency is, right, days per week typically. Intensity, we're looking at potentially heart rate. We could be looking at step rate. We could be looking at, if I was doing resistance training, like a percentage of 1 repetition maximum, I could be looking at a percentage of VO2 max. I could be looking at watts for power, right? I could be looking at RPE, so rating of perceived exertion. With intensity, one thing that's helpful to think about is, okay, if it's lower intensity, I'm probably leaning more on aerobic metabolism. If it's higher or anaerobic activity, or the type is like weightlifting, right, I'm going to be looking more toward those anaerobic metabolism things. And that can sometimes influence how I interpret the results of a study. Then we have time, right? You should be familiar with the guideline coming from the 2018 physical activity guidelines out of the Department of Health and Human Services. So that is that you should be getting 150 to 300 minutes of moderate physical activity per week, or 75 to 150 minutes of vigorous physical activity a week, or a combination of both, with every minute of vigorous physical activity counting for 2 minutes of moderate physical activity. Also, generally speaking, if you're talking daily time recommendations, we're looking at 20 minutes of vigorous physical activity per day and 30 minutes of moderate physical activity per day. For type, no specific recommendations, but if you are interested in different types of activity, using the Google Compendium to look up how intense a given activity is not a bad idea. Um, you also, in considering type, there are some things that you might want to consider, like the domain of physical activity that is being explored. You might want to look at whether researchers accounted for structured versus unstructured physical activity, right? Like we saw in Project Active a couple of weeks ago. You might want to look at weight-bearing activity, right? And whether or not they even measured these things, whether or not we got sort of context for the activity. Volume is typically measured by frequency times intensity times time. So some common measures of volume that you might see are met hours per week, met minutes per week. You might see kcals per week, kcals per day. For resistance training, often it's sets performed per muscle group per week. So a couple of different options for volume. For progression, I don't really need you to know what recommendations are for that. What I do need you to notice in a study is, did they progress people across weeks, right? Did the prescription for exercise remain the same in an intervention study, for example, or did it change across time? And then two things to consider when we're looking at interpretation of study data is, did they control for any type of nutrition or sleep? And it's really tough to do, especially in like prospective cohort studies, right? Did they actually measure those two variables as well? And therefore, could they control for them? But we know that timing of nutrient intake, as well as just general diet quality, right, can influence the adaptations that I might expect to get from a physical activity intervention, as can the amount and quality of sleep that I get. Okay, so you should be familiar with what the FIT-VP principle is, how it's different aspects of considerations for how it's measured, and what the recommendations for FIT-VP are. Okay, so we're going to look at a couple of things that I try to hit different aspects of the FIT-VP relationship, and talk about how they were measured and then what the effect on mortality was. So first we have frequency as examined by the Harvard Alumni Study. Okay, so this was looking at really trying to look at weekend warrior status. So we had men who were at low risk of mortality and men who were at high risk of mortality. And then we categorized them by being sedentary, insufficiently active, weekend warriors, or regularly active. So insufficiently active was categorized as getting less than, let me double check myself, less than 1,000 calories per week. So 500 to 1,000 calories per week in physical activity. Sedentary was less than 500 calories per week. Weekend warriors were getting greater than or equal to 1,000 calories per week, as were regularly active individuals, but weekend warriors had to be getting it on 1 to 2 days per week, whereas regularly active individuals could be getting it spread across the week. Okay, so what we found was, right, we've got our reference group. Okay, so reference group is the sedentary low risk population here. And compared to the sedentary group, the insufficiently active group, right, reduced risk of mortality significantly. It looks like we're at maybe like a 0.6 there, so 40% reduction in risk. My weekend warrior group looks like maybe they reduced risk a little bit more, but notice this confidence interval, right? Really large confidence interval. So maybe not statistically different from the insufficiently active group. And then similarly, the regularly active group, also really similar to that insufficiently active group. So in low risk men, it's looking like Okay, frequency might not matter, and even volume when I compare the 500 to 1,000 versus greater than 1,000, maybe not huge differences here. Now that does change, those patterns change a little bit when we're looking at high risk men. So for high risk men, now frequency seems to be a lot more important. Okay. So, right, we see that insufficient activity has similar risk to the sedentary group. We see that weekend warriors have similar risk to the sedentary group. The only group that had significantly reduced risk in the high risk group, right, was the regularly active individual. So higher frequency may be important if you are already considered at risk for mortality. And just for the record, the way that they categorized at risk was if you were smoking cigarettes, if you were overweight, so a BMI greater than 25, if you had a history of hypertension, or hypercholesterolemia. Okay, so that's what the high risk versus low risk groups meant. All right, so moving on to intensity. This is a really cool figure, I think. So first, knowing the difference between an absolute and a relative intensity is super important. So first, absolute intensity would say each activity that we do requires a certain amount of oxygen consumption. So 1 MET is my baseline value. It's how much oxygen I consume at rest. Okay. And we're going to go into this a little more in depth in a minute, but walking at 3 miles per hour typically takes, I think it's about 3.5 METs. Okay. So it's 3.5 times my resting value. Okay. Um, and that would be considered typically moderate intensity. So 3 to about 5.9 METs is considered moderate intensity, but that's an absolute measure of intensity, right? Um, often we often in large research studies, that's what we use is objective measures or absolute measures of intensity. But what can be really interesting is to look at relative intensity. So that would be, okay, yes, walking at 3 miles per hour requires, let's say, 3.5 METs. Okay. But if my maximal capacity is 14 METs, that's only, let's say, whatever it is, 30% of my maximal capacity. Okay. If, on the other hand, my maximal capacity is 7 METs, that's now 50% of my maximal capacity. And therefore, my relative intensity is going up a lot. Okay. So the relative intensity for the person with a max of 7 METs is working at 50% of their max, right? The person at 14 is only working at 30% of their max. So intensity is going to differ significantly between the two. Um, so I really like this figure for oopsies, for demonstrating that. So because we have a percentage of VO2 max on the left-hand side, and so, right, 83, so if you're walking at 3 miles per hour and your maximal exercise capacity is, this looks like 4 METs, right? That's really intense to walk at 83% of your maximal capacity, right? Whereas for a similar or for a more fit individual walking at 3 miles per hour, if that maximal exercise capacity is 14 METs, now same walking, right? But now that's only at 24% of your maximal capacity, so light intensity. Okay, so that's what this figure is demonstrating for you. All right, so then when we look at all-cause mortality, we can look at time intensity and type. So I'm going to move over here to the figure on the right first. So we have daily physical activity duration. So this is just minutes per day, right? Different measurement. We've got then all-cause mortality reduction. And what we see is that, so we've got also, sorry, vigorous intensity and then moderate intensity. Okay. So for a moderate intensity activity, to get a 20% reduction in risk, right? Oh, where is my laser pointer? Sorry. Let me get a laser pointer so I can. So to get a 20% reduction in risk, I had to do 40 minutes of, wow, my computer is just really slow right now. I had to do 40 minutes of physical activity at a moderate intensity. Now, to get that same reduction in risk with vigorous physical activity, I only had to do less than 10 minutes. Okay. So intensity does matter with risk. Now, intensity can be specific to an activity as well. So, right, this is the exact same figure, but now we're looking at running versus walking. Okay. And similarly, right, if I'm walking, I am getting about 12% risk reduction with 25 minutes of walking. But if I do 25 minutes of running, now I'm looking at about a 35% reduction in risk. Okay. So you can see how either for the same amount of time at a higher intensity, I get more reduction, or for less time at vigorous intensity, I can get similar reduction with an activity that otherwise might have taken a lot more time. Okay. And this was a study done, by the way, on 416,000 individuals in Taiwan. So we're looking at really robust data here. And there is a citation in the slide notes as well. So again, you can use these citations in your midterm papers if you're interested. So now we're looking at type specific fit VP. So this was just looking at runners, and this was a study done in 55,000 different adults. Um, and again, we're looking at hazard ratios of, at the top, we have all-cause mortality, and then this is cardiovascular mortality. And what I thought was really cool about this figure is, right, they broke up the fit V for us. So if the yellow line represents time, the red line distance, the pink line frequency, then we've got that lighter blue or purple, whatever that is. That's total amount. So that's basically my volume measure here, right? And then speed, again, sort of a surrogate measure for intensity. Okay. So they looked at non-runners and then they compared them to runners getting less than 50 minutes of running per week, less than 6 miles per week, 1 to 2 times a week, less than 500 met minutes per week, and then at a speed of less than 6 miles per hour, right? So this is just runners or sort of are maybe low intensity runners and comparing that with non-runners, right? So what we see is, right, significant reduction in risk for all-cause mortality with any degree of running. And then we do sort of see that risk level off after that initial jump down, right? We sort of see that level off at around, I don't know, a 0.6 hazard ratio, right? So I'm looking at about a 40% reduction in risk here. Okay, so pretty interesting. I would encourage you to maybe take some time and look at those different quintiles of the FIT-V and how they did or didn't affect risk. Just for the record, it does look like maybe we actually see a slight uptick in risk toward that really high end, and we're going to talk about that a little later in this presentation. Okay, so I wanted to give you an idea for calculating volume and what sort of met minutes per week might mean. In the study that you either read last week or are reading this week, I think, they use the number 11.25 met hours per week. So I thought I'd use that to give you some context for what does that mean? So if I take met hours per week and I multiply by 60, that gives me my met minutes per week. So these two are the same thing. If I take those minutes per week and I say, okay, I want to get that amount of physical activity, right? That's a volume of physical activity just by doing yoga. Okay, I would have to do 270 minutes of yoga per week because I got this that yoga is requires 2.5 times my resting rate to supply oxygen for that activity. Okay, for walking at 4 miles per hour, that's a 5 met activity now. Okay, so a little bit more intense, right? To get that same amount of physical activity or that same volume of physical activity, I'd have to walk at 4 miles per hour for 135 minutes a week. And if I wanted to run right now, that's a 9.8 met activity. I would have to do that for 69 minutes per week. Okay, so that's how it's calculated. And you can see that that's activity dependent, right? And time dependent, right? So I have to do one activity for a specific amount of time to get my total volume of physical activity. Now, if we're gonna dive a little deeper into the walking example specifically. So, oh, I lied. We're gonna jump into one other example really quickly, and then we'll jump into walking. So we've got all these different ways of being active, and asking like which pattern of being active is the best is really difficult, and it's really a question that hasn't been adequately answered with epidemiology. So I could be active so this is based off of 720 Met minutes per week. But to get 720 Met minutes per week, I could do 6 intervals of 30 minutes at a intensity of 4 Mets. Okay. I could also do 18 intervals at 10 minutes at an intensity of 4 Mets, or two at 120 at 3 Mets, or three at 60 for 4 Mets, right? So there's all these different patterns of physical activity that I could engage in as well. And ultimately, we really don't know which pattern is best at the moment. Okay, so coming back to then our walking, right? So we're not going to talk about different times or intervals of walking necessarily, but we want to take that walking at 5 Mets and say, okay, um, my baseline level is 1 Met, and 1 Met is represented by this 3.5 mLs of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute. That's the amount of oxygen that I use at rest per kilogram of body weight, right? So walking requires 5 times that amount. So walking at 4 miles per hour requires 17.5 mLs of O2 per kilogram of body mass per minute. Okay. Now I can convert that directly into calories. So I take that, I'm just going to convert my milliliters into liters because I know that for every liter of oxygen processed in the body, that requires 5 calories. Okay. So then I can cross out my liters and I get calories per kilogram per minute. Now that number really doesn't mean anything, okay? So now we're looking at body weight specific caloric consumption, right? So I have my body weight. I just used my body weight. I'm 165 pounds. I divide that by 2.2 to get it in kilograms. Okay. And then I multiply this number by kilograms. So when I do that, I get 6.5 for kcals per minute is what someone my size would be expending while walking, right? Note that that would be different for someone who is not my size, who is either has more weight or less weight than I do. Okay, so for me, if I wanted to get, right, we were talking originally about that 11.25 Met hours per week number. So for me, if I wanted to get 11.25 Met hours uh, per week, I would have to walk, right, at the 5 Mets for 135 minutes. And that would require me to expend 884 kcals per week. Okay. So again, keep in mind this is activity specific. It's also body weight specific. Okay. Now I'm going to really throw a wrench into this. Um, there's plenty of data to suggest that actually the resting level of oxygen consumption is not 3.5 mLs per kg per minute, that it's actually closer to 2.5, and that it's really similar between men and women. Okay. Note that then if I were using METs like some wearable devices do to estimate caloric expenditure, that changes my caloric expenditure a lot by 253 kcals. Okay. Um, so for someone who is tracking calories and wants to lose weight, that's a really big deal. And that's a really big difference. Um, Again, not to throw a wrench in everything, but also the calories that are listed on food labels can be incorrect. So anyway, that's neither here nor there, but for people who are potentially calorie counting or are interested in it, um, there are lots of potential issues with measurement devices estimating how many calories you're consuming. And adding up the calories you're consuming based on labels. Okay, so when we look at wearable devices like we talked about last week and estimating energy expenditure, they're often off and they increase energy expenditure by about, they overestimate energy expenditure by about 20%. Okay, and that would be accounted for potentially by this difference. Okay, because they're assuming that resting expenditure is higher than it is. Okay, this is just a fun chart showing that as intensity increases, the difference in calories expended as a result of that assumption goes up as well. Okay, so right, the difference at low intensities might be 50 to 100 calories. The difference at higher intensities could be 200 plus calories. Okay, so just something that's interesting and helpful to think about. Okay, so then we want to consider, now that you have a better understanding of sort of those, how we might operationalize physical activity and what METs might actually mean, or how kcals were actually calculated, we want to look at a potential dose-response relationship between physical activity and all-cause mortality. So first, there's no lower threshold for benefit. So with really low levels of leisure time physical activity in as measured by MET hours per week, we see significant decrease in the hazard ratio for mortality. Okay, so with what 2.5 MET hours per week, you're looking at about a 20% reduction in mortality risk. Okay, then we're now moving up to just under 10 MET hours per week. 8.25 MET hours per week. You get about 70% of the benefit that you get if you have really high levels of physical activity here. Okay. And that reduction looks like about a 30% reduction there. Okay. This is equivalent to getting about 150 to 300 minutes of moderate physical activity per week. Okay. So note that like we really don't see a huge reduction, still a reduction. So that's why we would consider this a dose response, because at higher levels of physical activity, we do see even greater reduction. But the amount of reduction here, right, was really steep. We saw like a 20% reduction. Then when we come up to this next level, right, now we're at another 10% reduction. Now here we're at maybe another 5% reduction, and here like another 1 to 2% reduction, right? So this really clearly demonstrates the dose response relationship that we think exists. And I'm going to cover some specific research studies that go over that now. So again, these are cited in your slide notes and also at the bottom of the slide here. But this study was looking at steps per day. And again, this was mortality rate per 1,000 adults per year. Okay. And right, we see pretty clear dose response relationship that as steps per day increase, we see reduced mortality rate. But you also see that it does sort of taper off at these higher levels of physical activity, and that there's really no reduction in risk beyond about 12,000 steps per day. Okay. Then they further broke up that data into men and women. And so what I sort of want to point out here is that for men, actually that reduction does seem to continue beyond the 12,000 steps, whereas for women, actually that reduction doesn't continue, and we may even see some slight increases in risk at really high levels of physical activity. Okay. We also see that across age groups, right, that actually steps per day is making a bigger difference in terms of mortality rate reduction in an older population as compared to a younger population. The AARP study is looking at retired individuals, so it's the American Association of Retired Persons. Again, pretty clear sort of dose-response relationship here with maybe a small blip here. So sometimes we'll call that a curvilinear dose-response relationship. This now was looking at intensity of activity. So they looked at inactive individuals, insufficiently active individuals, so getting less than 150 minutes of moderate physical activity a week. Moderate, so getting at least 150 minutes of moderate physical activity per week. People meeting vigorous guidelines, getting at least, and here they operationalized it as 60 minutes of vigorous physical activity per week. And then people meeting both of those guidelines, so at least 150 minutes of moderate and 60 minutes of vigorous, okay? And right, what we see is that when we go from inactive to insufficient, massive drops in both all-cause and cardiovascular and cancer mortality, right? Um, but that when we go to moderate intensity, we still get reduction, but not as much. When we go to vigorous intensity, in terms of all-cause mortality, really no significant difference, right? So maybe intensity doesn't seem to matter there. But volume of physical activity might, because when we are meeting both moderate and vigorous physical activity guidelines, we did see a continued reduction in risk. So again, looking at how intensity here is if intensity of physical activity also has a dose response relationship. And it looks like potentially, for sure, at least up to moderate physical activity. Okay, these are just data from some prospective cohort studies giving you some relative risks that you could potentially use. So we had the US railroad workers study looking at occupational physical activity levels. They classified them as low or high physically active with a relative risk of 1.5 in the low group. So there was a 50% increased risk of mortality with low levels of occupational physical activity. In the Finnish health study, right, 1982, again, looking at occupational levels of physical activity, we saw that in men with low levels of occupational physical activity, they had a 90% increased risk. In women, we saw a 120% increased risk. In the Harvard alumni study, we saw a 74% increased risk in men who were getting less than 500 kcals a week of activity versus greater than 2000 kcals a week of activity. In the Seventh-day Adventist study, right, we saw that comparing moderate people to inactive individuals, right, that there was a 39% reduction in risk for moderate physical activity. And note that that relative risk, when we switched to heavy physical activity, right, actually it goes up. So now the risk reduction is only 34%. Yeah, that's right. Okay. So again, that might be speaking to that intensity piece a little bit. We had the Iowa Women's Study. Now, this one was a little more interesting, right? Because now they're comparing different groups of physical activity as well as BMI. So the reference group was having a BMI less than 25, so considered normal or underweight. And the most active group, and they compared that with the high BMI and the active group. So really sort of isolating that high BMI piece, and what we saw was a 90% increased mortality risk. Okay, in those with normal BMI, but who were inactive, right? So now sort of trying to isolate that activity piece, we saw increased mortality risk of 55% compared to our reference group. And then in those with who had a high BMI and were inactive, we saw sort of this additive risk, right? So now we're at 142% increased risk. So it looks like those two factors compound each other. So similar to what we saw in that article from week 2, where having multiple risk factors was worse than having each one individually. And then we have this really cool Swedish twin registry study. So twin studies are really helpful in understanding the genetic component of eliminating the genetic component of mortality, right? Because we know that there is some influence of genetics on both physical activity, fitness, and mortality. Okay, so twin studies, right? Twins have the same DNA. Okay, and they were able to compare monozygotic twin pairs against dizygotic twin pairs. So twins who, right, have the same DNA versus twins who don't have the same DNA. And looking at moderate physical activity compared to low physical activity, now we saw a risk reduction of 16%. Is that right? Yeah, 16%. And for high amounts of physical activity, we saw a risk reduction of 36%. Okay. With the more active twin, and then when they compared the more active twin to the least active twin, a reduction of about 20% due just to activity, right? Not genetics and not theoretically the environment in which they were raised. Okay. So, and that's pretty typical that in twin studies, when we compare one twin to the other, we see less of a reduction in risk, right? Because we have accounted for the genetic piece of that. Okay, that was a lot to run you through. Again, maybe take a little break here. We're going to move on to talking about whether or not there's an optimal dose of physical activity. So, right, first we want to talk about, is there a minimum amount of physical activity that I can do to get benefit? And what we see in that the data that we've already examined, right, is that even really low levels of physical activity seem to decrease mortality risk. And then is there a maximal dose of physical activity? And I'm going to present some data in the next slide on this a little bit. But again, generally speaking, what we see in the data is no, there's actually not an upper limit. Occasionally, at really high levels of physical activity, we do see an upper limit. Although there's one study that was published, I think, in 2020, showing that running 50 miles per week, there was still room for increased risk reduction, essentially, that we didn't see risk reduction plateau at that point. Um, in considering optimal dosing, it's really, really tough to say, okay, well, what's the optimal dose? Because that would depend on your baseline fitness level, right? Again, we talked about sort of that absolute versus relative intensities. We can also talk about absolute and relative fitness levels, right? If I have really low baseline levels of fitness, my optimal dose might be really different than someone who has a high level of fitness, right? Also, if I am a 20-year-old versus an 80-year-old, right, that might influence optimal dose. Pregnancy status could influence optimal dose. Disease status could influence optimal dose, okay? So all of those things would need to be considered if I were going to create some perfect recommendation. So it's really tough. I would have to probably have population specific recommendations. And then for each of those then optimal doses, I would want to consider, okay, but what's the risk of them reaching that optimal dose, right? So if I have an individual who has cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, is a current smoker, has low levels of baseline fitness, right? And then I say that, okay, optimal dosing might be that that individual do vigorous physical activity 5 days a week for 20 minutes. Even if that's optimal dosing for risk reduction, what that could do is increase risk for a heart attack. It could increase risk for sudden cardiac death or cardiac arrest, right? So there are all these things that you would need to then consider to define optimal dose. So that's why it's difficult to define sort of an optimal dose. So then people will say, okay, well, what's the sweet spot? The greatest benefit for the least amount of time and effort. There are studies trying to get at that, but to do that again, you need really accurate measurements. And it's sort of what I was saying earlier, that would be outcome dependent, right? So that depends on what you're interested in, the biggest bang for your buck, right? Am I examining your risk for death or your risk for cancer or diabetes or cardiovascular disease or bone health or weight management, right? Like, what are you trying to get out of physical activity? And that would dictate where the sweet spot is. Okay. So these are all things that you should be considering, like when someone asks you what the optimal dose of physical activity is for risk reduction in health. So really briefly, this was looking at leisure time physical activity with moderate intensity or above. And this was examining, so 7.5 med hours per week is equivalent to about 150 minutes of physical activity, moderate physical activity per week. So this is essentially below physical activity guidelines. This would be meeting physical activity guidelines or going up as high as 15 met hours per week, right? So that would be double the guidelines. So if you're below the guidelines, so this would be maybe my insufficiently active group, right? Here we see a risk reduction of about 20%. If I'm meeting or exceeding guidelines, right, risk reduction now about 30%. If I'm 2 to 3 times above guidelines, now I've got a risk reduction of 37%, right? And we see that continue to go down. When we get to really high levels of physical activity, though, right, we see that actually that risk might go up, but also the confidence interval is huge. So I'm not sure if it goes up or not, is really what I would say. And this study was done on 661,000 adults. So again, pretty diverse set, very large sample size. Age was between 21 and 98 years old with an average age of 62 and a follow-up of 14 years. So really robust data here. So I would have a lot of confidence in these risks. Okay. And then this is just sort of what I was saying, right? We would expect different doses for different health outcomes. So this is looking at dosing for, oh, dang it. I didn't do those slides right. It's okay. This is looking at incidence of type 2 diabetes, right? And we can see that, okay, now recommendations might be a little bit different. And then this is the estimates from different studies. Okay. So, but still, we still see that pretty clear dose response relationship out to about 30 met hours per week, right? With maybe a little bit steeper reductions in that first piece. So still similar patterns is what we're seeing. This is a really striking study. So this is looking at hypertension now as the outcome that I'm interested in and met hours per week. And there really didn't seem to be any sort of plateau here, even up to 60 met hours per week. So again, that's where, right, risk reduction for diabetes looks like maybe it's plateauing a little bit at 30 met hours per week, right? And for mortality risk, looks like we might be plateauing at about, 22 to 40 met hours per week. For hypertension, not the case, right? For your risk for hypertension, you can be as active as you want, right? So that might also depend on your genetics, right? If you know that you're predisposed to hypertension, physical activity all of a sudden becomes really important. Okay, we're going to take a break here before jumping into talking about fitness.